Explore the importance of structure in your garden home next. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to the Garden Home, where you'll find practical ideas, beautiful landscapes, and much, much more to help inspire you to push the boundaries of your home right out into the garden, to the edges of your property. Now, in today's show, we're going to start here in my design studio. It's the place where I get so many ideas for the garden, and there's no idea that's more important than structure or framework when it comes to garden design. Before we go outside to take a look at some examples of structure and framework in my own garden, I thought we should go over a few terms that we'll be discussing throughout the show. The first is garden home. Now, this concept is just about expanding your living space outdoors. And the way I do this is through a series of garden rooms. And when I create a garden room, I always fall back on the 12 principles of design when I create a garden. It's a garden designer's checklist, if you will. Now, one of the most important, as I've already mentioned, is structure and framework. So let's head on out into the garden and have a look. A real hallmark of great gardens is the way structure is skillfully integrated into the overall design. It's almost seamless. You see, the combination is so on the mark that both the garden and the structure are enhanced. I've found that this same effect can be achieved on a much more realistic and modest scale in our own backyards. Here in my backyard of my garden home, I want to show you how I've taken structure and utilized it in the overall fabric of my garden. Now, when I was a kid growing up, I remember my granddad preaching the value of transforming a sow's ear into a silk purse. This idea of being resourceful and frugal was very important. One day I discovered a house that was going to be pulled down, and soon after I found this lot, which was completely vacant at the time. I brought the two together and created a garden home. You know, there's something exhilarating about taking an ordinary outbuilding and integrating it into the framework of a garden. This is true particularly in small gardens when buildings become part of the framework. You see, with some proper planning and some creativity, you can transform what might otherwise become an eyesore into something that has a functional and aesthetic purpose. You see, buildings can create a sense of enclosure, they can screen views, and they can serve as a focal point, at the same time satisfying a need. In this part of my garden, I've turned necessary structures into useful parts of my garden. I've taken the garage and used it as a border for the vegetable garden, and at the same time the garage serves as a screen from other houses and buildings in the neighborhood. A fence hides the alley beyond and gives my vegetable garden a nice neutral green backdrop. These rustic trellises provide support for vining plants. In summer, hyacinth bean vines cover the trellises with interesting purple flowers and seed pods. Even these raised beds here in the vegetable garden, which are very useful, add a touch of structure. Now, if I want to create a vertical element, I'll use teepees like this. They add structure, and I grow vines on them throughout the growing season. This tool shed in my garden serves many purposes. It's also a chicken house, and it supports this beautiful Lamarck rose. You should see it in bloom in the spring. And it's a focal point. Now, as you can see from your vantage point, that structure in the garden isn't just about buildings. Hedges can also make walls in the garden. Now, when I begin the design process, I often look for opportunities to combine man-made structures with the natural. And that's exactly what I've done here in this garden room, called the fountain garden in my garden home. You see, there are 4 walls to this room, and 3 of them are this clipped holly hedge. The 4th is the house itself. Now, there are large windows on this wall that look out into the garden, and this is particularly nice during the winter when I'm not out in the garden as much as I am during the growing season. The late fall and winter is an excellent time to examine the structure of a garden. You see, we don't have bloom or foliage to draw our attention away from the overall layout of the garden. If you want to create living walls or hedges in your garden, you might consider some evergreens, such as yew or Italian cypress, and of course holly. Hedges can also be created from deciduous plants, those that lose their leaves in the winter, such as hornbeam, beech, and spirea. Space can be a premium, especially in large cities where neighborhoods are often in high-rises. And when it is, why not garden vertically or against a blank wall? One of the best ways to do this is with a trellis. Let me show you how to make a simple and classic design that can apply to many situations. To start, you'll need a few 2x2s, 3 of them 6 feet long and 6 of them 3 feet long. When you're putting this together, there's no need for fancy cuts. Just place one board on top of the other with about 3 inches of overlap. Then space the others accordingly. Next, just attach them with some wood screws and drill at each intersection. Now you can put this together with a hammer and nail if you like. I've done this in the past, but I like wood screws because they don't split the wood. Now once you have the trellis assembled, this is what you'll need to attach it to the wall. 6 wood screws 5 inches long, 6 little pieces of copper tubing, a couple of inches long, and some washers. The tubing serves as a spacer that holds the trellis away from the wall. This gives the plants plenty of room to grow and provides ventilation behind the trellis. What a great way to create a beautiful wall of roses or a support for any other climbing vine for that matter. Structures, whether they're new or remodeled buildings, trellises, arbors, or even plant supports, all contribute to the framework of a garden's design. These are anchoring elements, a firm point from which we can begin to absorb and take in all the richness and diversity around a given space. During a visit to Chicago, Kathleen Galome of the Douglas Hare landscape architect firm showed me a garden where the structures surrounding it played an important role in the garden's overall design. So what do we have here, Kathleen?
Alan, I'd like to show you this garden.
Wow, this is beautiful. So often we think that if you live in a big city, you can't have a garden, but that's not true at all.
Not at all. It's amazing how much you can bring the views from inside out, as well as borrow from the other city views.
So this is an extension of the dining room.
Absolutely. I'm always looking for plant material that not only has fabulous texture, but also has, brilliant color. I want something that's going to be hanging over the edges.
I mean, I can see that with these beautiful calibrachoas and the geraniums cascading down, and then you've punctuated it with these osteospermum.
Yeah, these are great plants, vibrant all summer long.
Well, let's have a look at some of the other gardens that surround this beautiful apartment. Kathleen, this is an even better example of how the interior and exterior can relate to one another, mainly because of this picture window.
Exactly. What we tried to do here was integrate the fabric material and colors that we have on the interior with the plant palette on the exterior.
So you've used this basic, simple color theme where you have a range of greens from chartreuse to deep blue, green, and gray.
Exactly.
And then we have that accented with white and purple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great color combinations with the Tyrinia bouncing off of the Lysimachia, which is located here, which is a great
golden
trailer.
creeping Jenny.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Of course, this color palette contrasts to the one we just saw off the dining room, and that was all about contrast, lots of different colors, and this is more monochromatic.
Absolutely.
Well, the harmony that this creates really resonates with me. I just love the idea that the garden we just saw is truly an extension of the home. It's a beautiful place for the family to dine, entertain, or just relax. It's a great example of the garden home. Now, when I design gardens, I find that there are certain structures that are really beneficial and fit right into the landscape. I'd like to go over 3 of those. The first is the arbor. You see, an arbor can be a resting place in the garden. It can create a sense of entry or even frame a view. And often plants such as climbing shrubs or vines are grown on it. Just take a look at one of my entry arbors covered in New Dawn rose. Now, another structure that's indispensable in my garden is the loggia. Now, the word loggia comes from the same root as the word lodge or living space, and it's defined as a covered arcade that's open on one or more sides and usually attached to a building. It's an area that allows me to be outdoors, but in a protected, very room-like setting. I use my loggia as a work area. Often I make flower arrangements there, and since it's outdoors, the cleanup is a snap. I even paint on the loggia and enjoy entertaining there. And the third structure I want to tell you about is the pergola. Now, pergola is a classical term. It's a structure that's made up of columns supporting a trellis roof on which plants are trained to grow. Pergolas can come in a wide range of forms: classical, contemporary, even rustic. These are just a few examples of how structures, when placed in the garden, can play an important role in the overall framework of the garden design. Now let's take a look at another principle of design, that being frame the view. Think about a favorite picture. It's just natural to frame it. And when you think about the garden, the same applies. Garden design is often about just creating beautiful garden pictures. And when you make a beautiful garden picture, you certainly want to frame it. And there's where structure can really come in to help us. Now I want to give you a little tip on how to frame the view in your own garden. You can start by taking a snapshot of your property and put modern technology to work by blowing it up to a size about like this. Now, what I do is I literally take a pen and draw onto this the shapes and forms of plants that I think will help frame the view. On this project, we wanted to frame the view of this beautiful front porch with a classical pediment. So to do this, we used Italian cypress, framing each side so it honors the symmetry of the entire architectural composition. And then to add a little shade, because this facade faces west, I wanted to see what a tree would look like here. These are actually planted on the lawn. They're out from the facade of the house, away from the cypress. As you can see, this plan really played out because the Italian cypress honor the spirit of the Mediterranean style of the property, and they provide such a nice vertical element that lifts the entire composition. And I also like to draw in containers. We place these containers here and here. This is a great way to sort of work out scale, shape, and form. So often it's difficult to see the final result. So this is just a simple little technique that I use that helps me to visualize frame views. Now, carrying on with this idea of frame views, I'd like to take you to a beautiful garden on Long Island in New York. It's the old Westburry garden. This home and garden may surprise you because it looks like something out of 17th century England, but actually it was built in the 1920s. I was pleasantly surprised to find so many examples of structures framing views throughout the gardens. Have you ever thought about how a doorway, a gateway, or a passage such as this creates a sense of intrigue or mystery in a garden? We just by nature want to know what lies beyond. Well, this is just one of the devices a garden designer will use to create interest in a garden. Another thing that it does is that it actually serves as a way to frame beautiful views. And just look at the beautiful view that this entryway frames. And this is just one example of the many views you can find here. Probably the most extraordinary example is under the crescent-shaped pergola near the lily pond. As the visitor walks along the edge, you get these beautiful framed views created by the arches that support the pergola. Clearly this was created by a man with great vision, someone who was more than just a designer, he was an artist, because at each of these places one sees a beautiful vista, a painting if you will. Now what's interesting about George Crawley is that he was not trained as an architect or an interior designer or a landscape architect. He just had a gift and a passion to create beauty. Now you know, when it comes to creating gardens, framing the view and embracing those gorgeous vistas beyond is certainly part of it, but another aspect is screening out those views we don't want to see. I have to say, I always feel like I gain something by visiting a beautiful garden like Old Westbury and seeing the work of a talented designer like George Crawley. It's such an inspiration to see these beautiful designs. And I love distilling down often grand designs down to something that the average home gardener can apply to their garden home. Take, for instance, that beautiful pergola we just saw. It's very ornate and would be expensive to recreate. But there's another example of a pergola on the property that's done in the rustic style, which would be much more affordable and achievable. Just look how it supports these climbing roses. And just like its more formal counterpart, it's laid out on a slight crescent as well. Now, this notion of framing the view often works hand in hand with screening unsightly or unwanted views in order to create the most beautiful garden picture. A great way to screen views is with fences, walls, hedges, tall shrubs or trees, and even structures such as tea houses or covered patios. More often than not, structures exist in a garden out of necessity. I have a garage and tool shed that I had to work my design around. Then there are other gardens, principally these grand gardens, that have structures in them just for the sheer beauty. Now, I'm always having to weigh the effect of a structure in a garden as a garden designer. And there I always fall back on one of Thomas Jefferson's philosophies, and that was to create buildings that were not only beautiful, but useful. I had a client once that wanted to create a structure for a hot tub, and what they had in mind really didn't work with the architecture of the house. So I did some sketches and came up with a classically inspired building, or temple if you will, in the garden that reflects the architecture of the house itself. This idea just seemed like the best solution. We just couldn't have a hot tub stuck out in the middle of this beautiful garden. Somehow it had to be anchored to the overall landscape. Whenever I have the opportunity to help someone create a garden home, it's important for me to get to know that person, to understand their sense of style and their taste and the way they live in the space. I want the exterior, the garden rooms we create, to reflect the architecture of the home as well as its interiors. For instance, this home is a mountain retreat done in the rustic style. The exterior is covered with tulip poplar bark. It's decorated with rustic bits of trellis. It's a place for friends to gather, relax, and have a little fun. When I create a garden home, I like to draw from the spirit of the place and create that in the garden. For instance, in this home, I want to draw from this color palette that you find in this room. Whites, greens, accented with reds. I'll use all of those colors as I paint with plants in the garden. I'll carry the influence of this room even further into the garden room by creating a sense of enclosure. Just as we have walls in this room, we'll have walls in this garden, and those walls will follow this rustic mountain motif. Now the analogy even goes further. Just as we have an entry into this room, we'll have an entry into our garden room. And just as many rooms have focal points, in this case, a fireplace, our garden room will also have a focal point, which will help pull it all together. The challenge here is to create a garden room that's full of color through the spring, summer, and fall. Now what we have here is a largely shady property, but I think we've got just enough sun up there on that ridge to achieve our goals. Now we're going to create the garden room framework, and to do this, we've enlisted the help of master craftsman John Warren. John is much more than a landscape designer. He's also a musician. John, I'm really excited about this space becoming a beautiful flower garden. Well, as you can see from the drawings I sent you, this entry arbor would be here where these two stones are.
Okay. It looks like you're using a freeform mountain laurel.
Yes, I love that look. It's perfect for this setting and the style of the house.
Very natural.
Yes, marvelous. And the other thing that I like about that, you can see through it. It really blends with the landscape beautifully. Rather than having a solid fence along here,
exactly,
this gives you vistas into the natural landscape.
Doesn't cut you off.
And John, I envision a similar structure over there on the long line of the garden, a bower where you could actually sit. Let's go over there and talk about that. John, what I want to create here is really a focal point to help break up this long stretch of trellis.
Kind of a viewing area.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So the trellis would come up about, say, 5 to 6 feet on each side, and then the bower would create an arch
Okay.
as I've shown here on this drawing.
Right, help break up that long length.
That's right. Now when I lay out this space, I'll use a couple of tools. I'll use surveyor's flags and surveyor's paint. Now this will help me delineate between the walkways, the flower beds, as well as indicate where the trellis goes and the arbors. I'll also employ the help of John and the homeowner through the entire process. John, I've admired your work for a long time, and I just know what you come up with is going to add so much to this space. I'd love to know more about how you put your designs together.
Well, thank you very much. My wood shop is close to here. Would you like to take a look?
Oh, absolutely. That'd
Sure.
be great. Boy, John, this is quite a workshop.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, is this one of the latest and greatest?
Well, yes, this actually is a little coffee table that I'm working on, and this is chestnut wood from an old barn locally.
Now, the chestnut's extinct, isn't it?
Yes, it's was a blight actually caused by a fungus that the tree had, and they started dying in 1904 and were extinct by the 1940s.
Really? John, this is a wonderful coffee table. How did you get into this?
Well, I'll tell you how it happened. In my landscape business, we started making gates and bridges and natural features out of wood. And I thought to myself, well, gee, I can use these same elements to make furniture. And the way we work this wood is we use the old hand tools as much as possible. And that gives the irregularity that it's not perfect like modern furniture.
Adds so much charm to it. Now, John, this construction, this post and horizontal beam, this will be the approach you'll take when you create the trellis.
Yes, this is all really handmade. In fact, we make this union here, it's called a tenon joint. We make it with an axe. So it would be very similar to the post and banister we would use for the arbor and fence.
Now, John, this is a really handsome piece.
Well, thank you very much.
And you've got the mountain laurel legs here.
Exactly, yes. We try to bring that natural element into all of our furniture.
So beautiful.
Yes.
Now the laurel and the way you've used it here is the way you will apply it to the frame of the trellis.
Exactly.
So John, how do you hold the mountain laurel in place?
The way we have done it is we pre-drill the wood so it won't split, and then we use a cabinet screw. And then we put a dowel on the end of the countersink so you don't actually see the metal.
I see. Mm-hmm. And the wood screw is much better than the nail because the nail will rust.
The nail rusts and it doesn't hold. It can give and separate.
John, it's truly inspiring to find someone who takes otherwise discarded materials and creates such beauty with them.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the finished results.
Thank you.
As you can see, we've covered a lot of ground. When it comes to this design principle structure, structures can take on many forms and applications in the garden. So far we've seen how necessary buildings, or the buildings of utility, as it were, in my garden, have been worked into the overall garden design. We've seen how a Chicago family has used arbors and walls of buildings to enhance their garden space. We've been to Old Westburry for a look at an elaborate structure that helped to frame views. And we've seen how a master craftsman creates rustic garden structures in North Carolina. Earlier in the show, when we were outside looking at my garden, I talked about the idea of structure being beyond just buildings. It's about the framework of the garden, the way foliage works together to create the overall garden design. Now, this also applies to containers. Whenever I design a container, I start with the foliage as the structural plant first and then build out from there. In this container I designed for summer color, I used a spike or a dracaena as the anchoring center point. This serves as a tall and spiky element in the composition. Then I moved on to more round and full elements to fill out the container. Here I used geraniums and impatiens. In this composition I've used Sonic White New Guinea impatiens, geranium, Americana White Splash 2, and strawberry Parfait dianthus. As a finishing touch to the container, I added a few cascading elements. These spill over the edge of the container. Here I've used a common house plant, the old airplane plant or spider plant. And I've also used the beautiful gray-green helichrysum. This one's called dwarf silver. Now remember, when you're creating structure for a container, start with tall and spiky plants, then fill in with round and full, and then give your container that finishing touch with something to cascade. I can't tell you how much I enjoy this time of year when I can work on some of my designs. In today's show, we've seen the important structure plays on the design process. I hope you go away with some ideas on how to better integrate structure into the fabric of your garden home. From the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Alan Smith's Garden Home.
Hi, I'm Alan Smith. We're going to look at plants in a new way in our next show. We're going to begin thinking about plants the way children think of shapes. We'll also visit England and Holland and learn about trendy ornamental grasses that are all the rage, plus some tips on using color in your garden.